Hi everyone, welcome to the June 29th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and today on the podcast, we're going to look back at last Saturday's racing from Churchill Downs, where they ran the Stephen Foster, as well as a number of other stakes events. Letruska was in action in the Fleu de Lis. We saw some two-year-olds make their stakes debuts. Set Piece was an impressive winner of the Wise Dan, so we're going to look back at all of it, those races from Saturday, as well as a couple of other maiden races from early in the card. And this week, who better to help me go over these races than the person who actually called the action? So I'm happy to welcome into the podcast Travis Stone, the voice of Churchill Downs, who's fresh off the heels of another Churchill Downs spring summer meet. I've been lucky to work with Travis a couple times in the past, but it's been a while since we've had that opportunity, so I'm looking forward to going over some of these races with him. Travis, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here. It's good to have another meet behind us and onward to the Saratoga season.
Yeah, no, I'm happy that you're going to be up in Saratoga. I look forward to seeing you there. And the Churchill Downs meet, it always ends with a bang with this Stephen Foster card. And we saw some really nice performances on Saturday. Obviously, the Stephen Foster was the headline race, with Maxfield being the heavy favorite coming in. I mean, he looked like an absolute standout on paper. And I think he did what most people expected him to do, winning this race in pretty dominant fashion.
Yeah, I mean, look, it wasn't the world's strongest field that he had to face. I think the handicap division is feeling some attrition right now. But he still had to go out there and run it, and he did, and he ran well. And I think, this is his 8th career start. He's yet to really put forth a clunker. I mean, even his worst race, he lost to Grade 1 by a couple of lengths. So hopefully this puts him on the path to going on to the next level, if you will, facing some of the Grade 1 horses this summer and fall, and we'll see where he ultimately stacks up. But happy for Brendan, who had a great spring and summer at Churchill. And Maxfield, I think, is a cool horse. You can't really fault him for who had to face him this weekend, but hopefully we get to see some good stuff going forward too.
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of in a situation now coming into the summer where the older horse division, that traditional handicap division, is it's not really clear who the leaders are. I mean, Maxfield's definitely in the conversation. I would say that he's never really put in one of those breakout performances against the best horses in the division that would kind of single him out as the leader. But he's definitely in the conversation. Maybe down the line, he's going to have to answer that 1.25 mile question again, but it seems like going into the Breeders' Cup Classic, they'll probably try to focus on some of these 1 1/8 races. I know they've thrown about the Whitney as maybe a summer target for him, and that seems like a really logical spot. I do kind of want to see him put in one of those really big efforts with a higher speed figure than we've seen. He's getting those buyers, just around 100, a couple points higher than that. His TimeformUS speed figure for this race was a 121, which is, it's decent enough. It's good for a Grade 2 race, but you'd like to see him eventually take that step forward that so many people expected to see from him last year.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that he is capable of doing is adapting a little bit to the pace scenario. He's farther off the pace on Saturday. Felt like they were going a little bit quick early, and then they sort of settled down. The one thing about the mile and a quarter is he puts in this sort of long, sustained run. He started to move with about 3.5 to go on Saturday. It's really hard to do that, in a 10 furlong race as opposed to a 9 furlong. So maybe it does hint at his desire to be sort of at that middle route distance, not necessarily the classic distance. But no, it's a completely fair assessment. He has to run, that 105 to 110 number that wins the Breeders' Cup Classic. That would put him as one of the top horses in the division. And perhaps until he does that, from a horse player perspective, remain an underlay. But I hope he gets the chance to do it. And I hope he remains in good form, because he obviously has some talent. He's a good horse. And cool connections in terms of Brendan Walsh. Like to see him continue to progress.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, he's still relatively lightly raced for a horse in his 4-year-old season, so there definitely is still room for improvement there. But I agree with everything that you said about him having that nice kind of turn of foot that's really effective in these 1 1/8 races. He's able to put in that impressive run, and I agree with you. It seems like sometimes he doesn't get to use that same speed over the 1 1/4, and maybe that's to his detriment in those races. But he'll get the opportunity again as long as he stays sound. Yeah. The other important dirt race to discuss from that Saturday card occurred a little bit earlier in the day. That was the Fleur de Lis, another Grade 2 event, this one for the fillies and mares. And seems like Letruska has become a really popular horse in this game right now, and for good reason. I mean, she's just kind of a win machine. She beat Monomoy Girl early in the year, and she's really held her form well since that Apple Blossom. And doesn't seem like running her off and really has any ill effects on her, because she just keeps churning out these impressive performances. Obviously, it wasn't the toughest field on Saturday in the Fleur de Lis, kind of like Maxfield and the Stephen Foster. She didn't have that much competition, but she still looked great doing it. It didn't seem like they really had to go to the bottom of the tank.
I know, and I know you watch races a lot. I mean, one of the coolest parts about this horse is just how she looks early in the race. Her ears dance around. She just looks like she's having fun. Looks like she's nice and relaxed. And I mean, look at like you said, this was not the world's toughest assignment, but and again, they still have to go out there and run their race, and she just ran it so well. What I like about Letruska is she has now made 5 starts this year in a day and age where these trainers seemingly want to space races out between 60 and 90 days. She just keeps running and she keeps winning. And, look at these are horses, and eventually the well runs dry and you got to refresh it. But here we are. We're just about to turn into the second half of the year. They've won and you're in for the Breeders' Cup. They've piled up a couple of wins already. So now they have a lot of flexibility of how they want to handle her and in terms of getting her ready for the Breeders' Cup in the fall, as opposed to when you try and space those races out, it places a premium on your performances in those spots. And if something goes wrong, you can find yourself behind the 8 ball. So I respect and appreciate the fact not only is she doing well and the way she runs and the fact she's so consistent, but that they are actually running her. And I think it's good for the fans. It's good for the game. Easy horse to root for.
No, I enjoyed that same thing about her performance, as you said, in the first half of the race. She just looked so happy out there, and I love that when the front runner has their ears pricked forward. That's exactly what you want to see. It means they're, as you said, they're a happy horse doing it. I guess you could say that part of the reason that she was so relaxed early was that nobody took a shot at her. I mean, there were some other horses that had a little bit of tactical speed in this race, and I think maybe some of the other riders were just kind of hoping to get a runner-up finish in here, and perhaps that didn't work out so well for Envoûtante, who ended up kind of having to move in the fastest portion of the race. And Envoûtante, she is a talented horse in her own right. She's just not at the same level as Letruska, and she ended up finishing 3rd here, not able to make up ground due to that slow pace. But like you said, Letruska was just in another league than these horses.
Yeah, and one thing I will say is I did feel like, particularly in the first part of the card at Churchill on Saturday, the track was a little bit front favoring and helping horses along on the front. And I thought a little bit of that was evidenced by Antoinette sticking around for second. Maybe that was a product of the pace as well. But Envoûtante, to me, is a horse. I know, maybe I don't know. I actually don't know. I hope and I believe that there's a big win for her out there. I think she's really talented, and maybe it's just maybe this is her peak or her ceiling. Sort of that low 100, maybe high 90 type buyer horse. But I thought her not getting by Antoinette was maybe an indication that the track was a bit on the front favoring side, for whatever that's worth, maybe not much. But I hear you. I mean, it's completely fair. Like there was not a lot of early pressure for Letruska. Maybe the race was for second for everybody else. But I'm still hopeful that we can see something from Envoûtante at some point that puts her in the conversation as a legitimate grade 1 type distaff horse.
Yeah, she's kind of a funny horse because, I mean, personally, I'm not a big believer in that horse for course angle. I think with certain specific horses it works, but generally it's overused. But with Envoûtante, she has really only put forth these huge efforts at Churchill Downs, and you do want to see her take her good race somewhere else. And she might get a chance to run at Churchill again later in the year, but I imagine they'll perhaps take her to Saratoga this summer. I guess there might be other spots out there if they want to duck some of the best fillies in the country on the personal ensign. But I agree with you. She, on her best day, it seems like she could be a grade 1 filly. She just hasn't quite gotten that victory yet.
Yeah, I agree. We'll see.
Another grade 2 event from that Saturday card at Churchill Downs was the Wise Dan on the turf. And Set Piece has been a funny horse for Brad Cox. They've kind of handled him a little bit conservatively ever since he first came to this country, because it initially looked like he was going to go right into graded stakes races. He was so impressive, I think even winning his first race in this country, I believe, at Churchill Downs. And then things they went off course a little bit. He had some inconsistency. They tried him on synthetic a few times, but it seems like they've gotten him figured out now. And I mean, he's been one of the stars of the Churchill Downs meet this year, going 3 for 3 through the spring and summer. And this was arguably his best performance yet, because he beat a legitimate graded stakes field of horses like Some Like It Hot Brown and Field Pass, and nice ride from Laurent Giroux.
I mean, it was a race that he had no business winning the way it was shaking out pace-wise. There was not a lot of front-end action. Some Like It Hot Brown, a very dangerous horse when he gets to lead like he did. But Fleu, I mean, going on to the far turn, they were last or second to last with a lot of horses in front of him. They were down inside, and I was like, man, if he pulls this off, it's going to be something else. And he somehow did. You have to have a horse willing to come up the inside, too, to sort of shoot through those rail gaps, which a lot of horses are intimidated by. Maybe it helped that something like at Hot Brown was a little bit off the hedge and it was a bigger opening than you might expect. But yeah, there's no two ways about it. This horse is really developed, and I'm excited to see if he's going to be capable of taking the next step forward, because he's overcome less than fast paces in some of these wins, right? And if he's able to find, a lot of these mile races that we find in the fall, I'm thinking like the 4-Star Dave and the race at Keeneland, the Breeders' Cup. A lot of times those races get a little bit gassed up on the front end, and I mean him with some pace. I mean, who knows what he's capable of? But yeah, without a doubt, it's just a tremendous job by Brad getting this horse into peak form, and we'll see how far he goes with it.
Yeah, and I thought this was more impressive than last time because that victory that he put in the overnight stakes at the end of May, I mean, that was a race that featured a little more pace, and it kind of came apart a little bit. I also thought that was a race where the runner-up, whose name's escaping me now, didn't get the most clever ride that day, so I thought the margin of victory might have been a little exaggerated. But, I mean, Set Piece proved here that victory was no fluke. He just really has taken a step forward. I mean, he got a 125 TimeformUS speed figure for this performance. I think the buyer was a 100. I mean, those are graded stakes type of numbers, and this was a grade 2 event. I would imagine now there's going to be a grade 1 on the horizon for him, something that they haven't tried up until now, even though he's run some big speed figures in the past. But I mean, you think they can't duck it at this point, because he seems like he now is at that level. And I don't want to take anything away from some like at Hot Brown, who was second in here. It's kind of funny. I mean, I agreed with you when I was watching the races about the pace not being that quick, but I was looking at the TimeformUS pace figures for this card, and Craig had these numbers a little bit faster than I anticipated. Some like at Hot Brown actually was setting a legitimate pace, or I wouldn't call it fast. None of the fractions are color-coded red in the PPs. But in a weird way, maybe the biggest thorn in some like at Hot Brown's side was actually a stablemate Field Pass, who was just a little bit too keyed up in the early stages. And I think he pushed him a little bit more than some like at Hot Brown would like to be pushed. They did open up quite a bit on the rest of the field on the backstretch. And some like at Hot Brown dug in. He was just not quite as good a set piece on the day.
Yeah, I mean, Field Pass was keyed up, and I remember Ricardo trying to sort of settle him down a little bit. He was keyed up heading to the backstretch and midway down the backstretch, which was kind of bizarre coming out of a Mount 3/8 race in the Man o' War. You would have thought that maybe it'd have been a little bit more tempered or a little bit less enthused to sort of press that pace along. But I agree with that. And the one thing I will say about, so Churchill is removing its turf course. In fact, I believe it's already started. So that was the last day of turf racing on the current turf course at Churchill. So the turf has seen a lot of years, and I think the fractions have become a little bit tough to interpret in terms of, watching races live. Visually, it can look like they're doing the inverse of what the fractions say often. So I'm not surprised that Craig had this race coming back a little bit on the, the stronger side of modern, if you will, from a pace perspective. But yeah, I mean, the ultimate takeaway is that it's time for Set Piece to face those grade 1 horses, and we'll see where he stacks up when he does it.
Let's also mention a couple of the other turf stakes on this card for the 3-year-olds. There were 2 of them. The one for the males was the War Chant a little bit earlier in the day. Both of these races were at a mile, and they featured pretty similar pace scenarios in that, they didn't go that quickly up front, and that was very apparent in the War Chant, where it was just not really a competitively run race. And obviously there being so many scratches had a lot to do with that, as Next just got loose on the front end. But I will say about this horse, I mean, he really kicked it in through the lane to pull away.
Yeah, I mean, the scratches in there were disappointing. And I think if Churchill could do it over again, they would have swapped that race out of the pick 6 sequence. But at the end of the day, you're right. He did run, and he finished up strong. And I mean, even though it was a smallish field and maybe an uncompetitive race the way it shook out, it's not like these horses are nothing. Helium's he's a legitimate stakes horse. I don't know what grade you'd want to put him into. And, of course, he was pace compromised in this spot. But I will say this. There's one thing that I've just seen it happen now over the past few years, time and time again, is John Velasquez is such a good speed rider and identify situations where it's just time to go and take advantage of races. I know we could talk endlessly about these wins that he has doing such. It was just a good ride. And, he finished up fine. And we'll see, we'll see how things shake out. I mean, his one win at Kentucky Downs last year, he was able to sit a little bit off the pace. So it's not like he seems he's one-dimensional, but there's no two ways about it. 2 of his best efforts where he had big open-length wins, he was on easy leads, and those are tough to come across as fields get bigger and races get more competitive later in the year.
No, I think you make an important point about John Velasquez. I think you have to remember at the end of the day, the riders are human as well. And I mean, they can get a little intimidated. And when you've got a Hall of Fame rider like John Velasquez showing some aggression coming out of the gate, you often see some other riders defer to him a little bit, and he's able to take control of these races. And I mean, that's what he did with Next here. And I mean, credit to Wesley Ward for getting this horse to deliver a top performance on the turf. I think it looked a little bit uncertain what his preferred surface was going to be going forward. Obviously, maybe he didn't put in his best effort last time in the American turf. That was a much quicker pace than he had to deal with in this War Chant. But yeah, like we were saying, I mean, he really sprinted through the lane. So even though he got a perfect trip up front, he did do some running at the end.
Yeah, he did. He did. He's a good horse. We'll see what he does. Maybe come these 3-year-old races at Saratoga or Belmont in the fall.
We saw another front-running victory in the female version of this race, the Tepin, going that same 1 mile distance as Navratilova, stretching out from some sprints, was able to get to the front end and actually got headed coming to the wire, but she battled back pretty gamely along the inside to get the victory.
Yeah, this was. Look, I mean, in terms of the depth of field, I mean, I think this was a stakes field, but we're not talking about necessarily graded horses yet. They're going to have to keep progressing. We talked about Johnny V. Brian Hernandez had several phenomenal rides this weekend, and this was one of them. Just a perfect job of rationing out her speed, maintaining the pace, but not getting too crazy or too passive. As you know, a lot of times you see these riders give up that early advantage that they had in the race. He was headed with her, and they both responded well. I thought she ran very well. I thought New Boss put in a good effort as well, stretching out. Was sort of the suspect whether or not she truly wanted to go this far. She felt like more of a turf sprinter type, even though she had that nice mile win at the fairgrounds earlier this year. I felt like maybe her best stuff was going short, but she's developing as well. I think these are two fillies that, look, this wasn't a grade one. This was a stepping stone for them. We'll see where they can go from there. But good efforts on by both.
Yeah, Navratilova obviously got the right trip in this race going to the front end, and saving all that ground on the turf at Churchill is really important, and she was able to do that. I mean, she's a horse. When I was talking about this race on our handicapping podcast, The Forecast, last week with Emily Gullickson, I was trying to make a case for her because she had chased Dan Pearl into the Jessamine, and that was her one prior turf route. And I mean, last time out in that Mamselle, I mean, she was just, basically 6 wide coming all the way around the far turn. So she did have a big excuse that day. And Brian Hernandez was able to work out a much better trip for her this time, as you said. I mean, I guess if you want to say that one horse was maybe best here, it could be Toby's Heart, because she had to make a big wide run coming around the far turn. And this was a race that mostly held together on the front end. I still feel like Toby's Heart is probably better going a little bit shorter. It seemed like she just didn't quite have that oomph in the final 16th to forge past Navratilova. But she's a talented horse, too.
Yeah, you're right. She sort of did that move at that then fizzled out a little bit late, and you're like, maybe this is a filly that wants to go 7 at Belmont more so than she wants to go, 2 turns elsewhere, more of a shorter distance type horse. Because I agree, if you could argue that there was one that was best, it might have been her, just by the way the race stayed together. But I also felt like she had a legitimate chance to get by them and sort of flattened a little bit. So maybe that was just a sign of a distance concern with her. But she ran fine. She's a good horse, too.
The other 2 stakes events to mention from that Saturday card were both for the 2-year-olds, the Grade 3 Bashford Manor and the Debutante for the fillies. And on paper coming in, it certainly looked like the Debutante had attracted the stronger field of the fillies. There just weren't that many horses that had yet run fast speed figures in the Bashford Manor. And we kind of saw it play out the same way on the racetrack, as there was a lot of speed in both of these races, but the pace really came apart in the Bashford Manor. And Double Thunder, who was in the right spot early, far off that quick early quarter. I mean, he was just able to run the field down in the stretch.
I remember calling the race, and we're talking about Johnny V. I remember calling the race, and I look back, and this horse is way, way back. I'm like, oh dear. And I think I said in the call, I was sprinted. Didn't matter, because that's what needed to happen. The way that pace shook at him, and they absolutely flew in there. And you're right. I mean, on paper, this race was slower than the girls coming in, which is not totally unsurprising, because fillies tend to develop a little quicker than boys. This is one of those, like, good for Double Thunder, good for the connections. But, I won't be betting him with, anybody's money next time out, unless there projects to be this massive sort of meltdown setup. Just the way the pace shook out. They just went fast in there, and he took advantage. It was a good ride. Stuck to the inside, tipped out when it counted. And, hey, sometimes that's how racing goes.
Yeah, I agree with you. I would imagine that even Todd Pletcher is not viewing this as one of his best 2-year-olds. You would think that he's got some unraced ones in the barn that we're likely to see probably up at Saratoga that are a little more highly regarded than him. But he got the right trip here, and he definitely was ready to win early, and that's important in these races that are taking place in June and July. So, I mean, decent performance. The Buyer came back in the low 60s. He got an even lower, a 78 TimeformUS speed figure. Those are not the kind of numbers that are going to continue to win these 2-year-old stakes moving forward for the rest of the summer. So he's going to have to take a step forward. And I mean, typically in a race like this, I would look at the TimeformUS chart and try to point out some speed horse that got a really big pace bonus that's worth following. But I mean, the race just fell apart so dramatically that I think it's hard to even do that. Just doesn't seem like the strongest group of 2-year-olds. And there are probably some later developing ones that'll usurp these in the future.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I'm right there with you. I tried to look at the horses involved with the pace. Okay, who would you want coming out of this? And it's like, I think I'm going to have to let them prove to me that they belong in this sort of stakes caliber competition. I mean, because as you know, these races at Saratoga for 2-year-olds are not going to be easy. There's going to be a lot of precocious horses in there, and they're going to have to be sharper than what they were in the Bashford Manor.
Now, I do think we saw 3 pretty talented 2-year-old fillies in the debutante. I mean, this race came back significantly faster than the Bashford Manor, and it featured a pretty similar opening quarter. I think they went 1100 slower for the first quarter than the Bashford Manor, which is still a really fast pace. And it came apart a little bit, but it didn't, just go to deep closers like the Bashford Manor did. And Behave Virginia, I mean, you were talking about Brian Hernandez earlier, gave another perfect ride on this filly as she was sitting in that garden spot early behind the leaders, was able to save ground and come through between horses in the stretch. She looked pretty good in victory.
Yeah, this was. I felt like this was a stakes caliber race. I thought the top 3 are horses that we could see in some bigger stakes down the road. It was a phenomenal ride by Brian on Behave Virginia. She looked good in her debut when she won at the end of May at Churchill. She won by open lengths. The track had a little bit of moisture that day, so it felt like, maybe we'll see if she wants to do it on a completely dry track. She ran great, and it's not easy to have an easy lead maiden win and then come back and take some dirt and have to come through between horses to win against stakes caliber in your next start. So take nothing away from her. I mean, she had a good trip, but she ran very well. She's a good horse. On the 1s and 2s, though, the runner-up in there, I thought ran the best. That she got a little bit left at the start, was sort of out of position early. Maybe that was beneficial by the way the pace was ultimately going to shake out. But then she was wide on the far turn, and I think you could argue she moved a little bit early. And had you run that race 100 times without that sort of start, she might have been the one that gets the majority of the wins. I think they're both very good fillies, though. Looking forward to seeing them up at Saratoga. I'm assuming that's where both Kenny and Norm will go with these. And the fact that they were able to come from off the pace a little bit and still put in their run, I thought was encouraging. And a lot of times in those Saratoga races, when they go fast early, you need a horse that can come from off it a little bit and show that ability to rate. So, yeah, I agree with you. I thought this was definitely the stronger of the 2. And I think these top 2 are legitimate greatest stakes horses into the fall.
Yeah, for me, the biggest difference between the top 2 is that Behave Virginia just seems like she's a little more advanced in her mental development right now than on the 1s and 2s. On the 1s and 2s clearly has plenty of physical ability. I mean, she's a really imposing, pretty big daughter of Jimmy Creed. But she just looks a little green still in her races. I know that she was kind of hanging on the left lead when she ran her debut, and here she didn't break that alertly, had to make a bit of a run into the race around the far turn while going wide. And Behave Virginia just seemed a little bit more handy, willing to come through those holes. So, I mean, you want to see that, a horse that has that forward mental development with their 2-year-olds. But like you, I'm not going to be surprised if when on the 1s and 2s figures it out, if she's able to take a step forward past her in the future.
She is. She almost looks like a colt out there. She's just big. And, a lot of horsemen I respect here in Kentucky were talking about this race afterward. That's the type of horse that's going to be hard for Norm Cassidy to keep sound. She's just big and lanky. And, a lot of times they can get themselves into trouble when they develop so fast and are so large early in their career. So, I mean, that's sort of an interesting thing to maybe follow because she looks like a boy against girls. I remember her in her debut, I was sort of unimpressed by the debut. It's like, man, she just doesn't look as good coming down the stretch. And then the number came back fast. And obviously I was wrong about the visual on that debut, but she sort of looked similar in her second start. So, yeah, I agree. I mean, Behave Virginia just looked more professional, but both ran fine.
Yeah, and I don't want to give short shrift to the pace setter in this race, Wicked Halo, who, I mean, she was going really fast up front, and she was only beaten a length and a half for all of it. She actually got the highest TimeformUS speed figure of any of these horses of a 101. So she held on pretty gamely. She was a dozen lengths clear of the rest of the field in third. So, I mean, the other two seem like they're probably more apt to stretch out in the future than she is, but she's a pretty quick sprinter. So, I mean, I just didn't want to go without mentioning her. And speaking of these Steve Asmussen horses, we saw a pretty impressive maiden winner from him early on the day at Churchill Downs, a maiden race for the Colts that actually went significantly faster than the Bashford Manor over the same distance. And Gunite, who was a horse who had some experience coming into the race, I believe this was his third career start, that definitely gives these horses an edge when they're facing a bunch of first-time starters. But I wouldn't be surprised if this turns out to be a key maiden race moving forward.
Yeah, it feels like it felt live anyway when they crossed the wire. The way some of the horses ran in there was some early moves or some early speed that felt somewhat legitimate. I don't know what the number got. I meant to look at the number before we jumped on today. I'm kind of curious how that shakes out numbers.
Yeah, I think it was a 70 buyer, and Craig actually gave it a 96 TimeformUS speed figure with a little bit of a pace bonus. So, I mean, that's solid for 2-year-olds at this time of year.
Yeah, that's something to work with. And look, at Gunite had to deal with the rail, which is never particularly easy. He had not shown a lot of speed in his first two races, sort of outrun in each of them. Didn't have the best of starts, if I remember correctly, in his most recent start. So I had to break sharply in this particular spot with an inside draw. Did that and then finished up. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if look at Steve. We know where Steve's going to run with these. It's going to be one of the stakes races at Saratoga, most likely. And I would figure he rates a long look with this one.
Yeah, and the one that was a first-time starter that caught my eye out of this race was the third-place finisher, Rattle and Roll, who didn't get off that well and made a big run up the inside through traffic to get up for third. This was a son of that first-crop sire, Connect, so definitely some propensity to stretch out in the future for this Ken McPeak trainee. So he's one that I'll look for if he makes a start up at Saratoga.
Yeah, 100%. And it's interesting that Brian stuck around rather than go up to Thistledown to ride King Fury, which indicates there's a few of these horses he liked on this particular card as well. Because obviously King Fury could have some potential in some 3-year-old races with big money down the road. So maybe that's a little bit of a tip off. And McPeak, he'll win with a first-time starter, but he likes to let him develop as well. So I thought that was a good indication that this horse has a future as well. I agree.
One more race to discuss from that Churchill Downs Saturday card, and it was the first of the day, another maiden race, but this one for the 3-year-olds and up. And Roboman was pretty impressive winning this race. You know, it's funny, we have a nice group of 3-year-olds that have been competing in the Triple Crown races, but over the past month to month and a half or so, around the country, we've seen some really impressive 3-year-olds coming out of maiden and allowance races that are running some eye-catching speed figures. And I think you can just add Roboman's name to that list. I mean, he doesn't have a real traditional pedigree or trajectory from the start of his career, having began in a maiden claiming race, but I mean, he took a huge step forward in this performance.
Yeah, Mitchell Murrow had a fantastic meet at Churchill, largely riding the wings of Chris Hartman, who had a phenomenal meet as a trainer at Churchill this spring. Mitchell Murrow made very little mistakes from start to finish over the entire season. This is another good ride on Roboman. And I just found it interesting that he had dropped this horse in for 30 on debut. Almost, I don't want to, I'm not comparing these horses, but you remember when Service ran Maximum Security for a cheap price on debut, knowing that, you know, an older horse in the maiden claim, they're just not going to claim these very often. And it's almost like he wanted to get this horse going and then catch the $100,000 maiden pot in its second career start. He was huge. He was huge. I was no two ways about it. It was a fast time. It was a big win. And yeah, I mean, we'll see. We'll see where he develops. You know, I don't think we'd probably expect him at Ellis, maybe in a nominee one other than type spot for him next time around. But this was a big effort.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that he's going to be the kind of horse that's winning graded stakes later in the year, but I mean, he got a 93 buyer for this performance. The TimeformUS speed figure was a 110. That's knocked down just a little bit because it wasn't as fast of a pace as we saw in some of the other dirt sprints on this card. But that's a really solid number for a 3-year-old breaking his maiden, even in the summer. And I mean, you can see why they ran this horse for a tag first time out. I mean, he doesn't have that much pedigree. He's by that sire Vancouver, who's was an Australian bred. He's been versatile, getting runners on dirt and turf. The dam sire is a Naba. I mean, you would think this horse would have more of a turf pedigree, but he's been running well on the dirt, and I guess we'll just have to see how much farther he can develop and how far he's ultimately going to want to go as far as distance goes on the racetrack.
Racing is just such a crazy game. $14,000 auction purchase, and they get out in one maiden win at Churchill. It's just so funny how the game
I know.
work out. You know.
Well, that's all the action from Churchill Downs, but I do want to get Travis's opinion on a couple more races from around the country last week. Two graded stakes for the 3-year-olds, actually. At Belmont Park on Saturday, they ran the Grade 2 Mother Goose. Not the biggest Mother Goose field in the world from the quantity of the field perspective, but you had some talented runners in this race. Obviously, Clairiere, who was coming out of a 4th place finish in the Kentucky Oaks for Steve Asmussen. Always Karina, who was really highly regarded coming in off a couple of blowout victories for Chad Brown. But it was a pretty substantial upset as Geel for Todd Pletcher, the same connections as Mala thought. She finally delivered on the hype that she had racing over the winter at Gulfstream Park. Took a huge step forward to win this race. I don't know where it came from, but it came back reasonably fast.
I was watching the race and I'm like, all right, well, this feels like always Karina's just going to kick on with it from here because she seemed talented enough and fast enough to do that. And then all of a sudden, Zagil just would not go away. Next, she's in front and she's winning. And I'm like, okay, well, this just must be a clunker of a stakes race. But then the number came back okay. And so, I don't know what to think. I guess you could argue that, lightly raced horses and 3-year-olds, they're prone to jumping up with big performances here or there. The one thing I liked about the ride by Joel was he never really let Always Karina totally get away. He kept tabs on her the whole time. A lot of times that's all it takes is to sort of get that competitive spirit going in a horse. But I felt like the move to turf last time was a give-up move on Zagil and was never fast enough to compete with Always Karina. Next, she does, and okay, okay.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what to make of this one. I mean, I didn't see it coming. She just kind of seemed like an easy horse to throw out from consideration in this race based on her form. But I guess it was a good sign that Todd Pletcher was keeping the faith with her to run her in a race like this, and she finally delivered. I mean, when the pace is this slow, I'm being a little hypercritical here, but you wonder sometimes if riders overrate their horses a little bit, because obviously Always Karina has a ton of natural speed, and she could have opened it up a little bit more on the front end, and she kind of let some other horses come into the race, and then you turn it into a sprint to the wire, which isn't always in the best interest of a speed horse, especially on the dirt. But as you said, the speed figure, when you look at it, it says that she did run her race, Always Karina. She was just second best on the day. And I guess the horse that was most compromised was Clairiere, who stumbled coming out of the gate and just got no pace to close into. She probably has another forward move in her, but she just was not going to find the right scenario in this race.
Yeah, and the problem is just, as a closer like that, she's going to have to find the right scenario next time as well. And, very pace dependent, these types. But she's a good horse as well. Yeah, right. She was compromised in this spot. And she'll ready to look in, a race like the Alabama, where it feels like 10 furlongs would be fine for her. It feels like she could run all day. It's funny. He was going in. It's not the largest field of horses you've ever seen, and it felt like it was basically one horse race, and it ended up not being. And I think all top 3 horses are legitimate going forward.
Yeah, and I should mention, as I alluded to, this race got a 96 buyer. The TimeformUS number was a 110. That's knocked down a little bit, I think about 4 points from the final time number due to the slow pace, and we will deduct for slow paces on the dirt that advantage horses towards the front end. But still, the buyer, that's kind of right on par with what her stablemate Mala thought ran in the Kentucky Oaks, and I don't think anybody's mistaking Zagil for Mala thought moving forward, but it was a race that looks like it might have some quality moving forward, so I'll be interested to see how these horses develop and race in their subsequent starts. One more race to talk about on this podcast that's going out to Thistledown in Ohio, where they ran the Grade 3 Ohio Derby, and the bettors just could not get enough of Mask Parade in this race, a horse who was really impressive winning that allowance race on Derby Day, I think by almost a dozen lengths, and he got a legitimate speed figure in doing so. They went for him over some horses with proven stakes form.
Yeah, they did, and I think the race ended up being a little bit tighter at the wire than the odds would have indicated going in. I think this is a good horse for Alstall, though, and I like how he's developing him, sort of taking his time, allowing him to find his zone. I get it that they sort of came together late in the race in the Ohio Derby, but also Mask Parade, he was a little bit wide and put in a bit of a sustained run. I guess the pace slowed down in the middle portions. But I feel like this is a horse with potential, and we'll have to take another step forward to maybe even a step and a half, you could argue, to compete against, some of the top tier horses in this division. But But this is also sort of, it feels like a group that's ripe for someone that's coming on in the second half of the season. And this was the perfect race to step forward for him. And I'm curious how he does next time around when obviously the waters will get tougher. It's going to be more difficult in the subsequent starts from here. But I thought he ran fine enough. And, it's not like Keep Me in Mind and King Fury and those types are complete slouches. They're competitive, grade 2.5 to grade 3 3-year-olds at this point, and maybe more grade 3. So we'll see. We'll see how this develops. But I thought it was a good step forward for Masquerade. I think he's maybe flying under the radar a bit in this division.
No, I think it was the kind of performance that you'd expect from horses that are going to the Ohio Derby, and he got the job done over some runners who were not quite good enough to make their presence felt in the Triple Crown races and the Derby preps. And he is the one coming out of this race that does have that upside. And be just coming off that Dominators of One victory, you'd imagine that he'd be able to move forward again, even though it took him a few starts to break his maiden. It seems like now Allstall has him going in the right direction. So this is when you could see horses continue to move forward. And now he's got these 2 victories going a mile and an eighth, so he's answered the stamina question. As you said, the race did tighten up a little bit late, I think more than I would have anticipated when they came into the stretch. It kind of looked like Masquerade was traveling well, and he might be able to go away from these horses, and he didn't quite do it late. But I mean, he was dueling with a Todd Pletcher horse and Promise Keeper, and those kinds, they just never seem to give up. Those Pletcher horses always find more, and Promise Keeper really stuck around and dueled him all the way to the end, and King Fury and Keep Me in Mind just kind of stayed on at one pace and were able to get up for second and third here. But Masquerade has looked good, and I think he's one that might be able to make his presence felt in some of these summer stakes races. Don't know if they'll go for a race like the Travers, but it's not like he's running speed figures that are that far off some of the top 3-year-olds out there.
No, I mean, there's one more step forward. He gets into that conversation. Who knows how races like the Jim Dandy shake out. And I'm getting this feeling that Hot Rod's are going to run in the Pacific Classic instead of come back east. And so it could open up that race a little bit. Or Masquerade's going to end up in like the Oklahoma Derby in the fall and, be a prohibitive favorite in there. And Allstall will sort of take the more conservative route like he did with a horse like Blame, not comparing the two, but remember he allowed Blame to develop a little bit more and deeper into the 3-year-old season. So, he's got to step forward if he wants to compete in a race like the Travers. But as you know, there's flush 3-year-old races out there deep into the year that they can sort of pinpoint and, rack up the funds rather than face the big boys.
Well, that's all the racing to recap on the podcast this week. Travis, I want to thank you again for coming on and filling in for Craig. Missed having Craig on these podcasts the past few weeks. He's still recovering from his procedure. I'm hoping that I get him back pretty soon. I'll have to text him after I get off today to see how he's doing again. But I have enjoyed the opportunity to get to talk to some guests on this podcast, and I really want to thank you for coming on and recapping some of these races after getting, just finishing a pretty busy Churchill Downs meet.
You got it. I enjoyed it, and hopefully we'll see you in Saratoga.
Yeah, looking forward to it. I'll be up there for at least a couple weeks, so maybe we can hook up there and get a drink or something. So, Travis, great to talk to you today. Remember, everybody, you can always catch these TimeformUS podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. So, thanks for tuning in this week, and make sure to catch the TimeformUS forecast where we do some handicapping later this week on Friday. I'll be having handicapper Nick Tamero on as my guest there. We'll probably look at some Belmont races from Saturday. So look forward to that coming up this Friday.